Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to our community partner, the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, for supporting today's program. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow. We at the Holocaust Center for Humanity acknowledge that our Holocaust Center is on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The month of November is designated as National Native American Heritage Month, and Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, marks the National Native American Heritage Day. The day celebrates the vibrant cultures, traditions, and heritage while recognizing the many contributions Native Americans have made. For many of us, the first time we learned about Native Americans was in elementary school with the story of Thanksgiving. The Thanksgiving holiday is based on a meeting that took place in 1620. Part myth, part history, the story goes that English colonists of Plymouth and the Wampanoag people shared a feast. Over the next few days, the two groups socialized, and this sealed a fragile truce between the two groups for several decades. But the tensions eventually erupted into a war that killed 40% of the Wampanoag people, and many of their men were sold into slavery. The story of Thanksgiving is about the colonists. The voices and the history of the Wampanoag people are left out. Paula Peters, a Wampanoag, recalls her second grade classroom learning about Thanksgiving in the 1960s. She writes, "When the teacher mentioned we're all dead, that was devastating. I raised my hand and I said, no, that's not true. I'm a Wampanoag and I'm still here. Part of my everyday being is telling people that we're still here." The Wampanoag is a proud tribe today with more than 2,600 enrolled citizens. They have inhabited present-day Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island for more than 12,000 years. Thanksgiving has become important to the United States' image of itself as a nation. Underneath it all is a country that started as a project and grew at the expense of Native people, explains Paul Chatt-Smith, who is the co-curator of the award-winning exhibition Americans at the National Museum of the American Indian. Thanksgiving is a holiday for family and togetherness, but also thinking about the origins of our country with both its tragedies and successes. When we study the Holocaust, we seek to understand not only the particulars of this history, but the patterns of genocide, exclusion, and racism that persist across cultures and continents. Through studying the Holocaust, we learn the importance of opening our minds and hearts to learning about other cultures so that we can better understand how we might stand by their side and how we might be effective allies. And in the case of the Thanksgiving narrative, at its heart is the celebration of the idea that when people actually meet each other, rather than just holding abstract stereotypes in their minds, when they actually come together and talk to each other, barriers can be broken down. We have seen this firsthand at the Holocaust Center. Our Speakers Bureau, consisting of survivors and their descendants, is consistently one of the most powerful and impactful experiences for students. Hearing from a real person share their firsthand personal accounts changes hearts and minds. I'm so pleased to have with us today Ine-Marie van Dam, a member of our Speakers Bureau, to talk about her mother, an Auschwitz survivor, and her own experiences. Ine-Marie was born in Holland after World War II and grew up on the Dutch Caribbean island of Curaçao. Ina and her family moved to the Pacific Northwest when she was 9. Fascinated by language and cultural diversity, Ina says she dreamed of living, studying, and working abroad. She graduated with a double major in French and political science from the UW and then moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where she completed a degree in conference interpretation. Ina is fluent in a number of languages. She works as a conference interpreter in Europe, the US, and around the world, and has taught translation and interpretation at various colleges and a number of government institutions. Ine-Marie will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A option on your screen to type in questions at any time. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please enter questions in the comments. Thank you so much, Ine-Marie, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ilana. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ilana. Thank you, Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity. And thank you. Well, I'm particularly excited because we have with us today in the audience friends, family friends, and family, some of whom don't know my mom. So I want to introduce you to my mother, Ine-Marie van Dam. Here we see her on the left, age 3, with the requisite ribbon that all girls of that day and age wore. And at age 18, after 5 years of war, 4 months of recuperation, she's back in the Netherlands. She came back at age 18. She's 17. She's 18 here. And, you know, you look at her and she's beautiful. Of course, she wouldn't have thought that, but yeah, makes me, well, she's beautiful. What can I say? The next slide I have to introduce is going to say, I decided to tell my mom's story. But the fact of the matter is I didn't know my mom's story. None of us did. We knew she'd been in the Holocaust. We knew she'd been in the camps. We knew that we were Jewish. That all of that was out in the open. But we didn't know the story. And I think in large part, many people handled it this way. They didn't want to burden their children with the horrors of what they had lived through. That doesn't mean that the children weren't burdened in some way or another. I'm the firstborn. Perhaps I feel it more strongly. I don't know. But I think many children of survivors, and it goes further than that, suffer from something that psychologists have long known about. It's called the triple T. TTT as in trauma, the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And it's real. We know it's real, but we didn't know it was also biological. And neurobiologists are now studying the matter and finding that there is all sorts of evidence that trauma gets transmitted, and not just to the first generation, but to the following generations. So I was terribly bothered by the fact that I didn't know her story. And that's why I decided to tell her story. To do that, I got a lot of help. First of all, we had to convince my mom to tell her story on videotape for the Holocaust Center. About 3 years ago, she agreed to do that. And you can tell it's a hard thing for her to do. She didn't want to. I finally said, Mom, do it for the grandchildren. They're going to ask someday. You need to tell them. And so she did. And with that, for the first time, I had the narrative. I had the chronology. I understood she was here first. She was there then, and then this. You see, I had known little snippets, a little incident here, a little incident there. But if you don't have the narrative, you don't know how to put it together. So with that, we had the story. And with the help of the Holocaust Center, we put together the PowerPoint that you're going to see. Yes, let me go back 1 minute, just a second, and say that the TTT that I mentioned is being studied under the name of epigenetics. And it's interesting, it's a subject worth exploring. In any event, I set out to learn the story. I am continuing to still learn more and more of the story, and it's continuing to unfold. But let me, without further ado, introduce my mom. And I need to warn you that apparently there may be some issues of volume. Do not despair. We have a volunteer who has kindly captioned her voice. So one way or the other, you'll get the message. And notice too, please, you can tell she's uncomfortable. She doesn't want to be there. She didn't sleep several nights before she did this, and she didn't sleep several nights after she did it. So I'm grateful to her that she was willing to do this. And here she is, Ine-Marie van Dam. She'll be here any minute. There she is. Okay, let me introduce you to
my name is Ine-Marie van Dam. My maiden name was van Esso. I was born in Meppel, that is a small city in the northern part of Holland.
Meppel, Holland. The Netherlands is also known as a tiny country in the northwest of continental Europe. Let's take a closer look. It's known, of course, for its not capital, but largest city, Amsterdam. And my mom came from a town called Meppel. This is in a very rural part of the country, and it's a very sparsely populated country in a generally densely populated country. Holland at this time had an overall population of almost 8 million people. So she said it's in the north, true enough, but take a look, it's also very close to the east. 40 miles separates Meppel from the German border. And that border, that colossus on the right, that's Germany. On the west side and on the north side, we've got water. Holland is famous for how it's dealt with its water and its dikes, etc. And on the south, we've got a small country, Belgium. But hugely large is looming over the whole, certainly the eastern part of the country is Germany. So let's take a look at my mom's life in Meppel. It's pretty nice. They're middle class. Her mom is on the far left here. I'm named after her. Her name is Marie. She's there with her sister and her parents. In the lower left, you see well, you can't really see her, but she's graduated with a degree in home economics, and this is what girls of her standing and her time did, and that was in order to prepare her for marriage. And here she is on her wedding day, and then a few years later with their oldest son, the firstborn Leo, my mom with, again, the requisite ribbon, and her little baby brother, Mauki, Maritz was his full name, but he was nicknamed Mauki, who had to be institutionalized. He was both physically and mentally impaired, and they could not take care of him at home. So they had been there for generations, but meanwhile, before my mom's birth, about 10 years earlier, World War I had come to an end. World War I had not gone very well for Germany, although Germany had started it. And with the terms of the Versailles Treaty, there were extremely stringent reparations imposed on the country. And this led to inflation, to unemployment, to all the miseries that you can imagine when an economy is stretched and can't manage. And so here you see just one picture. This was in 1932, and it's in Hamburg, which is in the north of Germany. And that's just that one day, that's the line in that part of the city. And where the red arrow is pointing, it says, Wählt Hitler, vote for Hitler. And as we'll find out, they did the next year. When things go badly, you need to blame it on someone or on something. You don't want to take the blame yourself. That's a very human, normal phenomenon. And so what happens next? Well, they blame the communists, they blame the Jews, they blame any other groups whom they think that they can blame. And that's sort of par for the course. But meanwhile, back in Meppel, my mother blissfully unaware, her parents perhaps not so much, of what's going on next door. They're spending time on the beach, they're walking in town. My grandfather, Mayor van Esso, had a wholesale retail jewelry business, and this is the retail portion of it. The rest of it, the wholesale portion, he did on the road. He traveled quite a bit. But meanwhile, again, let's take a look at Germany. A year after those lines were forming in Hamburg, the Nazi Party wins the majority. They appoint Hitler chancellor, and within months they give him emergency power through the Enabling Act, it was called, the Ermächtigungsgesetz. Nice fancy word to say you can do anything you darn well please. And that's what he started to do. Meanwhile, I think my family must have been getting a little nervous. There's a lot of anti-Semitism on the rise. My mom's best friend stopped talking to her. She lived across the street and wouldn't talk to her. The family had turned Nazi. And they needed to make some changes. And so what they did was they packed up the family and they moved from Meppel to get away from the Colossus. Also, Meppel had a very small Jewish population of less than 300 families. And so they decided to move to Amsterdam, not the capital, but the largest city in Holland, and with a population of 80,000 80,000 individuals, Jews, who lived there. And so that must have felt a little safer to them. There were a number of other factors as well, but geographically, but I won't go into those. In any event, they moved to Amsterdam. You know, it's only 85 miles. It's really no distance at all, but Holland is a very small country, and you go from one country to one city to the next, accents change, dress codes can change. And so moving from a rural, sparsely populated community, my mother ends up in this large cosmopolitan community, but she clearly made friends and she adapted, and she's mentioned that, you know, she had to change her accent because they made fun of her for her accent. In any event, they moved to Amsterdam, and meanwhile, anti-Semitism is becoming official and it's on the growth. It's on the rise in Germany. Anti-Semitism, pretty obvious, it's prejudice against or hatred of Jews. And it had existed in Europe for hundreds of years, but in Western Europe, the Jews had been very much assimilated and integrated, and they considered themselves to be German or Dutch or whatever it was first, and Jewish in the same way that other people had other religions. Hitler believed in a concept of racial purity, and he assigned people the name of Aryan, and decided that only Aryans would be allowed, for instance, to sit on this bench where the dog is having a nice day, and that Jews would be a threat to the purity of the Aryan race. And he considered the Jews to be subhumans or Untermenschen, and felt that they needed to be first removed, and he had other plans, but never mind. I should mention, incidentally, that a few weeks ago, the Holocaust Center had a speaker in who spoke of the influence of the American Jim Crow laws on the whole anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Apparently, Hitler studied what had been done in the United States and used that as a guideline for how to go about creating his regime. So that's something to certainly think about. Holland had been neutral during World War I. They had hoped to remain neutral in World War II. That was not to be. And when the Nazis invaded, they invaded 3 countries all at once: Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And this was the famous Blitzkrieg. So these tanks, the soldiers, the airplanes, everything was thrown out the country. Holland had been neutral, and so they didn't really have a whole lot of an army. They weren't terribly well equipped. They weren't terribly experienced. And so it didn't take long for it to become obvious that the Dutch weren't going to be able to win. And then on day 5, May 14th, the Nazis bombed Rotterdam to smithereens and offered to bomb other cities as well, which offer was rejected, and the government capitulated, and the Queen and the government went into exile in the United Kingdom in London. So all of a sudden now things change. We're living in an occupied country. And that means that an awful lot of things are going to change for everybody who's living there. Well, and especially, of course, for the Jews, because here's what happened. The Germans believed in this concept of, they thought that the Dutch were almost German, they were almost Aryan, they were brother Germanics in their words. And so on that basis, they had planned to go in very gently. And they did at the beginning, but eventually they toughened up, so to speak. For the Jews, however, that was a little different. They were told they couldn't have radios, bikes, that's a huge thing, telephones. A curfew was established with very inconvenient hours, of course. You couldn't go shopping at the time that you needed to go shopping. In any case, you couldn't take the tram at some point. So no tram, no bike. And, you know, weather in Holland isn't always the best. If you were Jewish and owned a business, that business would be confiscated. Yes, at some point you had to start wearing a star. My mom is going to tell you about that in just a minute. And when she does, I want you to watch her body language. There were deportations increasingly. There were what they called razzias, which is raids in the street. People just get picked up. There was a general fear that spread through the entire population, and particularly through the Jewish population. So here she is. Watch her body language, and here she'll tell you about it. Well, no, before she tells you about it, I'm so sorry. There was a great welcome provided to the Nazis by the Dutch Nazi Party, which had formed in 1931. It became openly anti-Semitic in 1938 and was there ready to welcome the German troops as soon as they marched in. They helped establish the government. They were the only political party that was acknowledged once the occupation started, and they were, from all accounts, at least as bad as the German Nazis. And so here's my mom about the occupation.
Well, life changed. We still could go to school, but after a year we had to wear a star. And we couldn't go to the schools anymore. So there were schools that especially for the Jews, and people came but disappeared. And we never knew if they were picked up by the Nazis or did they go in hiding. So I don't know.
So that's...
Well, life changed.
Oh. We'll get to the next slide in just a minute.
But after a year, we had to wear a star. And we couldn't go to the schools anymore. So there were schools that especially for the Jews, and people came but disappeared. And we never knew if they were picked up by the Nazis or did they go in hiding. So I don't know.
Now let's try that again and see if we can.
Life changed.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Richard, can you help out here? There we go. Okay. Life under Nazi occupation. This is the Jewish school, for the Jewish kids. Incidentally, there's somebody in there who lives in Seattle today. This is the star she's referring to. It says Yod. It would have said Juif in France, and it would have said, or did say Jude in Germany. It doesn't matter. It made it very clear that you were Jewish and you were increasingly alienated from the population at large. The school that my mom ended up in was the same school that Anne Frank went to. They didn't know each other, but she's one of the ones who disappeared at some point, and my mom wouldn't have known what happened to her because, of course, you didn't tell. At some point, my grandparents obviously started thinking about what could they do? And there were two options. One was to go into hiding. That was really the only one that most people thought was possible. And to do that, most people, unlike Anne Frank, most people had to split up their families. There was hardly anybody who could take into hiding an entire family. That didn't happen. And my grandparents didn't want to do that. So they found what they hoped would be safe places for my grandmothers, both of whom were still alive, for little Mauki, whom you saw earlier, who was in an institution. And then they packed up and they paid somebody to get them out to Switzerland. And that did not go so well. So here she is telling you about that. She'll be here in a minute, I promise. And she'll even talk in just a minute.
We were told if we would go to the train station, we could take the train to go to Switzerland, and that would be taken care of. And it was totally crooked. It was somebody who took all the money and saw to it that we were all put in prison. At the station where we went in, we were picked up in Venlo, that is at the border, and we were sent to the camp in prison in Cologne, Keulen. And from there, we were transported to Berlin, and that used to be an old people retirement home, and there they put all the Jews in, and from there they put us on the train to Auschwitz. we were told that we would go to the...
Richard, why is it doing that? Thank you. So that was the plan, to make it down to Switzerland, which is circled in red on the map. They didn't make it. They went as far as Venlo on the border, and then were picked up. They were taken to Cologne. They were imprisoned in Berlin. They went from Berlin to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And now on this next section, again, watch her body language and watch her, yeah, just, and let's hope that the slides work.
We were put in cattle cars. This one was covered. And we sat there without anything, without food for 4 or 5 days, I don't remember, till the train stopped, and it was in Auschwitz. When we came out of the train, we were put separate, the men on this side, the women on that side. A doctor was looking at you, and he went like that. And one went to the camp, and the other one went to the gas chambers, but we didn't know that.
And she remembers exactly. She remembers exactly what was to the left and what was to the right. Here is a later transport of Hungarian Jews as it happens, and you can see the men and the women are separated on the slide on the left. On the right, these are all women. Any women who came with children, young children, would get selected out, as they had the whole world of this Third Reich, the Holocaust, was a constant stream of selections. So the women who have children, they get selected to go to the gas chamber. And my mom and her mom were both deemed fit. She was 15 years old. Her mom was 40 years old. They were both deemed fit to go ahead and work for the Nazis for a while until they didn't live anymore. And so that's what happened. And she was there from April until January, April 43 until January of 1945. That's a long time. There are a lot of interesting facts here. It's the largest concentration camp of its kind. There are 1.1 million prisoners murdered. Almost 960,000 were Jews. And those are significant figures, but imagine you're 15 years old. You come from a middle-class family. You walk into something unimaginable. You've just been through a lot of fear. You've been through a couple of prisons and a horrible ride in a train, in a cattle car. But this is beyond belief. This is beyond imagining. And the first thing that happens is you get shaved, all body hair, not just your head, so nobody can recognize anybody. You're issued, you get deloused. You're you're tattooed. I forgot, you're tattooed, yeah, on your left forearm with a number. And from then on, you will be known by that number. That's your name. And you are issued some sort of striped uniform with whatever footwear happens to be available, whether it fits or not, doesn't really seem to matter. So all at once, overnight, she's been robbed of her family, because within very short order, her mom dies. Her language, Dutch is not a vehicular language. My mother had a little bit of school German, but all of a sudden she's thrown into an environment where she's got to operate in a foreign language. She's, her youth, well, she's 15 years old. And her language and her family. And that's overnight, that's what happens. So from there on, there are going to be a lot of decisions that have to get made. And I think that those must have been moments of real fear as well for her. The first thing is that she's told abruptly that Dutch Jews don't last. She'll be dead within 2 weeks. And yes, one of the things that they don't tell you with the facts also is that the world, the hell that you've come into, has an unimaginable stench. It stinks to high heaven. They're burning bodies. Of course it stinks. It's noisy. People are shouting and screaming. There's dogs barking. There's a constant stream of schnell, schnell, schnell. You know, you hurry, hurry, hurry. There's you're hungry, of course, you're thirsty. That's all beyond imagining. There's never a moment to sit quietly because you're constantly on your feet and you're constantly being called for roll call. It's called appel. And the Germans like to count exactly how many people were when they were all supposed to be where they were supposed to be. So this is hell. And somehow or other, she doesn't really know how, within about 2 weeks, she's offered a position in a laundry. And she doesn't want to take it. She wants to stay with her mom who's dying. But in the end, she becomes convinced that that's what she should do. And you're going to watch a very different person come out here. When she talks about the laundry, it's and her work there, yeah, you'll see.
I worked in the laundry. So you had a laundry, you had the nähstube, the room where you had to be sewing, where they had to fix everything, and then the room where they would do the ironing, all for the Nazi uniforms. So I worked where we had to do the washing, and there's a big wooden things like that, and we standing, and then we had a washing boards, and you washed. And after that, you put it somewhere else, and then it was going in the room where it would be dried, and from there it went to the room where it would be fixed. And when we were washing, we tore it, because that would be work for the people who had to fix it. You know, so you did things, whatever you could.
That would be work, and also that would be an extra day of life for that other person. And let's hope that we now can. No, Richard, I clicked the wrong click there. Let's do this. Bear with me, folks.
I did it because everything you can do to damage anything that belonged to the Germans, you do.
And now she's going to tell us how she thinks, why she thinks it is that she survived. She always told us it was dumb luck that she survived.
The Polish Jews have been prosecuted for years, so they had more skills how to handle it and what you could do. I mean, I won't say it was foolproof, but they survived comparatively much better. And the reason I survived was because I was in that laundromat. That was a building, it was downstairs, comparatively to Auschwitz and Birkenau, it was luxury.
So let's leave her pause there for just a minute. It's a nice smile. It's getting to be the end of 1944. It's becoming clear to a lot of people, and there are a lot of rumors in the camps, of course, but they're only rumors, you never know, that the Russians are coming close. Most people seem to have known, or at least the rumor was pretty confirmed, that the Allies had landed a little earlier, and there was hope for the first time. And of course, that meant that the Germans wanted to make sure that their camps were not discovered by the Soviets. And so increasingly, it was becoming obvious that the prisoners, the slaves in Auschwitz were going to get moved. And of course, with her cohorts, with the ladies she worked with in the laundry, they would discuss, you know, are you going to go? Are you going to stay? Are you going to hide? What are you going to do? And there's another decision point. And she decided that she was going to go. She would go on whatever it was that they were doing. She wasn't going to stay behind. She did manage to organize, is the word that they used to use, organisieren, to liberate, we might say, in fact, today, a few extra articles of clothing. I don't know how. She says she doesn't remember. But that meant that she had a little bit of protection, because what they were going into now was the grimmest part of her experience yet. And it's called the Death March. And we will get there as soon as my clicker does what it's going to want to do. Richard, any advice? There we go. Thank you. Right. So forced marches, evacuations. So they want to get the Jews out. They want to destroy any evidence that they've had any sort of operation of this type. The date is January 18th, 1945. And it's called the Death March because 1 out of 3 people died. It was freezing cold. It was the coldest winter on record. That's true in Western Europe as well, but Eastern Europe always gets colder than Western Europe does. 1 out of 3 people didn't make it. Those who did, and those who didn't were either, if they dropped out, they were either shot or just left to freeze. This journey took her to, it was done in part on train and in part by, well, cattle car. Here, let's go look at the next slide. Let's first take a look at how she walked. This is roughly 370 miles, the distance of San Francisco to Los Angeles. And where it takes her is Ravensbrück. The journey was done, the trip was done partly on foot and partly on, in uncovered cattle cars. Remember, she said she had done the trip to Auschwitz had been in covered cars. These were uncovered cattle cars in the coldest winter on record. So by the time she gets to Ravensbrück, she's pretty well depleted. She's exhausted. There's another selection. She almost gets selected, but she somehow or other, it talks them into the fact that she's strong enough to still continue working. And so she doesn't get selected. She is sent to an outdoor work site, outdoors in the coldest winter, and is set to pick nettles with bare hands. So I can't even begin to imagine. I do remember that, oh gosh, a number of years ago, a friend of mine raved when she was visiting me at our house about the latest thing, which was a nettle soup. And I saw my mother just wince, the very concept of it, no way. So let's leave her here. She's depleting. She knows that she doesn't have long to live, and people knew that. Meanwhile, in Sweden, up north, there is an aristocrat by the name of Folke Bernadotte, who has been aware of the fact that there are plans to liquidate all of the people who are in camps throughout the Third Reich as soon as it looks as if they're going to get taken over. So they're not going to give anybody up. Well, Bernadotte enters into contact with Himmler, and there's books about this, it's a fascinating story, and makes arrangements to do a swap. He wants first Swedish and then later Scandinavian prisoners to come back to Sweden, and he will give Himmler a certain number of other people whom he wants. So it takes forever, but they eventually do a deal. And eventually the group of people who are going to get saved or rescued grows increasingly. They do an operation in various camps, and finally there's a final operation, and it's in Ravensbrück, and it includes a number of French, Belgian, and Dutch women who all get put in, and you've got to imagine what this must have been like, in a white bus out of the blue. I don't think my mom even remembers the other buses. She just knows that all of a sudden she's placed in a white bus. She remembered that it was white. She doesn't know that there's a red cross painted on the top of it, so that the Allied bombers would not hit them, although I think 1 or 2 did get hit. And they go straight to the border without any food. They get out of Germany, and they go to by boat, and finally then she gets something to eat, to Denmark, to a town called Malmö in Sweden, and then to a tiny little town called Skatås, I hope I'm saying it right, in Sweden. And as much as my mom never talked about the camps, Sweden, oh my God, Sweden was wonderful. She had had more than enough food. They had taken such good care of her. She had lived, she was there for about 4 months. She was placed in a cabin with a number of other Jewish women. I think a lot of them were a bit older than she was. And the interesting thing is they weren't Jewish. The other women weren't Jewish at all, because, it wasn't just Jews who were being persecuted by the Nazis. I'll give you a little list of them. It was the Roma. We used to call them gypsies, now they're Roma. They were persecuted. Homosexuals were persecuted. And we're talking being put in camps or tortured or whatever happened to occur to them. The physically and mentally impaired, my uncle Mauki. Jehovah's Witnesses. Anybody who had anything to do with the resistance. Criminals. common petty criminals, but also hardened criminals and communists and, you know, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. So Sweden was wonderful. She began to recuperate there. She says that at the beginning, this is the first time that they're getting enough sleep, but she had a hard time sleeping because of the nightmares. And she mentions that several times. And finally, the time comes where they say, okay, we're ready to send you home. And there's an airplane. Whoops, that's not where we are. I do apologize for the mix up with the Richard, why don't I give it over to you? And tell me how to do that.
Okay, Ina, I got it.
Thanks. We need to go back 2 slides. Thank you. Okay, so so the next slide will show them getting ready to get on an airplane and head out to Holland. She's 17 years old. She's just survived 3 years of occupation, 2 years of concentration camps, 4 months of recuperation. She looks pretty normal there in terms of size. She was 60 pounds when she came out of the camps. They gave her an extra egg while she was in Sweden. I'm sure that was part of why she loved it, but she shared it with her seven cabin mates. But now she's going back to regular life. And I think it must have been very difficult. She's told a few stories, and it was clear that it was hard to reintegrate. You know, for all these years, she'd had to deal. Well, I'll talk about that later. But it was difficult. It was difficult integrating back into life and to be socially appropriate. The first thing you have to do, of course, was to find a place to live. She found a place to live with friends, family friends, but she wanted to be on her own. She'd been surrounded by people all of these years. She just wanted a room of her own. And so she found a room and was then approached by the various authorities who said, but you mustn't live by yourself. You're only 17 years old. And she said, excuse me, I survived 2 years of Auschwitz. I think I can manage. Thank you very much. I'll be perfectly safe. And so basically she became what we would now call an emancipated minor at age 17. So she had a place to live. She needed to go to school. You can't get anywhere without a high school diploma. And the regular schools weren't going to cut it. That wasn't something that she could imagine even thinking of doing. And it so happened that the Jewish organization, the Jewish community, including teachers who, or people who had survived and who were willing to teach. Some of them were professional teachers, some of them were not. And so something was organized for all the Jewish kids and other kids for that matter who'd gone through the camps and who had been in hiding and who had therefore missed out on their education. And this was basically an AP program on steroids, 2 years in one. And apparently it was a super excellent program. She speaks warmly of it. And from time to time, everybody would abandon class or they would run off because a new train had come in and there would be a list by the Red Cross of who had survived, who was coming back, and everybody is looking for relatives. What happened to so-and-so? Nobody knows. And so at this point, let me introduce to you, let me first look at what had happened to all these Jews. Let's take a look at the next slide. There were 140,000 Dutch Jews in Holland before the war. That incidentally is only 1.5% of the population. 5,200 survived the deportations. My mom was one of them. People who were in hiding did generally a little better, but in any event, the stats are pretty grim. Now, let me now introduce you to somebody who did survive, and he did it by escaping. When it was thought it was impossible, it turns out that you could escape if you had connections with the resistance. My father had a background as a Boy Scout. He had a degree as a lawyer. He connected with the resistance. He later says of his work, he said, I did some anti-German activity, which I think is just lovely. And he got out on foot and by whatever vehicle, I'm not sure, but certainly over the Pyrenees, he did that on foot in order to get a boat to go to England, because people who got to England, and there was only 1,700 of them who managed it, were called England sailors, Engelandsvaarders, and they were the ones who made it because England is where the government, not quite yet, Richard, England is where the government is located in exile. So now we have his departure from Rotterdam, November 26th. He does that entire trip and crosses the Pyrenees Mountains. That part I know for sure is on foot, and then quickly over to Barcelona and back over to Madrid, where he's in prison for quite a while, and then finally to Portugal. This is 7.5 months that he's been doing this trip. In Portugal, he has a chance to relax because they're waiting for a boat, and he goes to a little town called Sintra, which has evermore been known in my family as my mom's Sweden, if you will. It was his Sintra. And then from there, the boat finally arrives and takes him over to England, where he enters into training to with the in Wolverhampton. That would be the next slide, Richard, where he joins the Irene Brigade, the Princess Irene Brigade. It's a unit of the British Army, and then goes over to Normandy about 2 months after the Normandy landings by the Allied, the June 6th. This is August 28th, and then fights his way through France, through Belgium, and makes it finally into the Netherlands, Holland, where he is demobilized, and where people who are in touch with him send him names of relatives or relatives of relatives. He had a lot of contacts in New York. And so people are sending him names. Can you find out what happened to so-and-so? Can you find out what happened to so-and-so? And my father ended up with a list of 52 names. The last one on that list was my mom. And the other 51 had not made it. But he met her. They somehow or other continued to meet. I don't really know the details. They never told us. But clearly, they were in love. And it's interesting because my mom had said, she's told us this before too, she had said no, she didn't, when she came out of the camp, she would never marry a Jew because she didn't want her children to be Jewish. She didn't want any chance of that happening to her family. So, well, she met my father, they fell in love. There's a 12-age difference in age, 12 years, but they were both young at heart and also very wise beyond their years. They had both gone through an amazing things. So they got married. They did what everybody did. They founded a family. So I was the first of that part of the baby boom. And you see me there on my dad's shoulders, and I look like a pretty happy little baby. And we're living in Eindhoven in the south of Holland, and things look like they're going very well. And then the Korean War breaks out, and rumor has it that Holland and Western Europe might well be under attack. The Soviets are getting very interested in occupying us. And my parents did not want for even one second to contemplate living under such conditions. So they left. They didn't have much time to prepare. They ended up leaving very quickly. They took with them my dad's younger brother, Andre, and they packed up their families. I have two cousins. We have cousins the same age as the two of us, my sister and myself. My sister was a newborn. They packed us up and they took us over to a place you'd never guess. It's a little island in the Caribbean, and it's called Curaçao. Why Curaçao? Well, it's a Dutch territory. My father believed, wrongly as it turns out, that he would be able to get a job as a lawyer, because he was a lawyer. Turned out that it was a little more complicated than that. But my dad's brother ended up leaving. They didn't like it there, and they went on to parts further south in South America. But my dad and my family, our parents stayed. And I have to tell you, this became my Sweden. My mom was only 19 years older than I am. I had a little sister to play with. We were outdoors all the time. We had activities. My mom organized all kinds of fun parties and events. So it was a wonderful place to live. And then finally, the reason that we had stayed was because the intent was to get over to the United States. And finally, the visa for that came through 6 years after we had started living there. And so my father started the trip on his own. He went to New York, and then he went over to Seattle. He had picked Seattle for a number of reasons. And he ends up in Seattle. He finds himself a job. He finds himself a house for us to live in, and a car, and then he sends us a telegram and says, come on over. And so we pack up and we follow the same journey. And that takes us to a new piece of our lives. We become immigrants in the United States. And as immigrants, we did what all immigrants do. We all learned English. Well, my father already knew English. He lived in England. My mother had schoolgirl English. My sister and I didn't speak English. My brother didn't speak. He was about 1 year old. My father worked during the day and then he studied. He didn't want to continue to be a lawyer because he couldn't here. So he decided to become a CPA, and it took years and years, but he studied every night, and I remember that. And he became a CPA. My mother was super active as she had been in Curaçao. I didn't mention that, but she organized so many things. She was super active here as well. She was our den mother in Bluebirds. She finally, when she saw that she was going to become an empty nester, she decided to enroll at the University of Washington, and she did a BA there at the same time that I was a student at the UW. And she would phone to say she was coming over. She'd never come over unannounced. She knew better. And she would phone and she'd say, can I come over and can you correct my English on a term paper, which she always had ready 3 weeks ahead of time. And I would do that, and then we would meet and have coffee on the Ave in the University District, and coffee was something nice to eat with it. And those were nice moments. And that paper got her an A+, and it should. It's called Planned Deviant Behavior. And should you be interested, there's a copy of it available through the Holocaust Center. And yeah, life went on. My parents looked forward rather than backward. That was very much the message. They didn't talk of their experiences. Interestingly enough, in the camps, part of the survival motivation had been so that we can tell what has been done. And yet at some point she stopped wanting to do that. She felt it was negative and she didn't want to do that. She doesn't understand why I'm doing this. I'm finding that it's giving me real satisfaction to connect with students when it was in real life, and to see their response and to be able to talk to them. It's also really special to connect with people through Zoom who know her and who are contributing to the story. So the story is still unfolding. And let me just close by saying that we all have a story. And I hope that perhaps you too will start looking for yours. Meanwhile, I'm really proud that I had an opportunity. Incidentally, this picture was taken at our St. Nicholas party a couple of years ago. Today, she's almost going to be 93 years old. She's in a safe environment. She's well cared for. She's in dementia. And I'm really proud to have had a chance to tell you her story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ine-Marie, for sharing your mother's story with us. It has so many aspects to it that could become full presentations in and of itself. We have a question here from Martin, and he asks, any idea how much post-traumatic stress disorder your mother experienced even into her later years? I know she seemed to compartmentalize her past from her current life, but were there also other ways you were aware of that helped her get through all the difficulties she experienced?
You know, that generation didn't talk of post-traumatic stress. And so at the time, it never occurred to me. I think that there's definitely a PTSD thing going on. Has it gotten stronger? Probably. She's always been fearful. And she was anxious, for instance, with the last election, not this last one, but the one before, was very, very anxious about what was happening to the country, seeing that it could replay itself. You know, we always grew up knowing that it could happen again, that this wasn't a one-time deal, that it could happen anywhere, anytime. And that perhaps is also incidentally what motivates me to do this, to tell the story. Thank you.
Another question comes from Jessica, and she asks if there's anyone else in your family who continues to tell your mother's story and maybe your dad's as well.
Not yet. Thank you.
maybe to come.
Who knows? Who knows? I would certainly encourage it. There's certainly, no, let me add to that and say what we are finding in the family because of this Zoom world. I've had the opportunity recently to get in touch with cousins whom I don't know personally. You know, I mentioned earlier that we went to North America. My uncle went to South America, and we were in touch with each other. We certainly knew of each other. Occasionally there were visits back and forth. When I was 14, I got to spend some time in their family, but you know, we didn't grow up with them. And now all of a sudden, because of Zoom and because I included them in the first Zoom session that I did, I said, hey, you guys are part of the story. If you want to come, you know, now you can. And the rest of my family. So little stories are coming out and connections are being created within the family that I think are just a priceless gift, an unexpected opportunity created by the fact that we all have more time. Thank you.
Well, Ina, thank you so much for sharing your mother's story and your own story with us. It's really incredible. And I know there were a few other questions. We'll pass those on to you after the presentation so you can see them as well. I know many of your friends and family are joining this presentation too. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to all of you that this program was recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow, should you want to go back and see it or share it with others. It takes a really dedicated team at our Holocaust Center to run all of these programs, including our virtual speakers bureau, which Ina is a part of, if you're interested in bringing her for future programming. We also have virtual professional development programs for teachers, lots of online resources, and so much more. These programs would not be possible without the generous support of our donors. And if you'd like to support our virtual programming and the center's mission, please check out our website today, or of course, please consider us on Giving Tuesday. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, who you heard briefly during this presentation. He's our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show behind the scenes. Also, a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Dretel, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. Thank you also to Michelle Quinones for providing closed captioning for today's program. Next week, please join us for Building Bridges, Latinx Representation in a Holocaust Museum with Dr. Michelle Tovar, who's the Associate Director of Education and Latino Initiatives at the Holocaust Museum, Houston. For many communities, a Holocaust museum represents a rare space to discuss hatred, prejudice, and apathy openly. So this will be a very unique and interesting conversation. I hope you will join us next week for this program at the same time. In the meantime, have a great Thanksgiving holiday, and we look forward to seeing you next week. This concludes our program.